Set 9 is going to change TFT forever, and this is why right now might be the best time to relearn how to play the game completely. Here's why. TFT used to be a game where you could do the same thing over and over. This made templates and guides very easy to create and follow in a short amount of time. People always talk about how important fundamentals are in TFT, but no one actually wants to learn them. People just want an easy way out through an instruction manual, but that is about to change. In Set 2, I made a leveling guide that is still pretty relevant today, and it gave people a template on how to level up and when to level up in order to hit whatever rank they desired. How did I make it? I just watched the best players play and recorded all of their leveling intervals in a notepad and then copied it. It's really not rocket science. However, games in Set 2 were essentially the same every game, but games in Set 9 have a whole new dimension. Portals, legends, augments. These all make each game unique, and it'll be a lot rarer to play the same game you did previously. Now, I know what you all are thinking. We've already had a bunch of these mechanics before. In Set 3, galaxies were essentially the new portal mechanic, and forcing certain playstyles could still be done without legends. After that, augments have existed since Set 6. By the way, in case you do not know what portals or legends are, do check out my Set 9 preview in the card up here. But in Set 9, can TFT players study the same exact way they did before? Well, probably not. In the past, most players just got better by reading guides, analyzing stats, albeit mostly incorrectly, and watching streams. However, I think now the best way to improve is to just play and use your own brain and creativity. Before, when just one or two major mechanics existed, many players could just memorize what to do in every situation or just play 1,000 games and figure everything out by brute force. Now that might be different because there are so many more major mechanics that change the game drastically. For example, one portal is called Still Water Hold, and this removes augments from the game. What are the best comps in this scenario? Can you still force a lose streak like you normally did and then spike in stage 4-2? Should you level up to level 7 on stage 3-5? Is the Demacia or Piltover comp stronger on this portal? What do I do if I have a Jhin 2-star but only have AP items on stage 2-1? What's funny is that we as players have become so accustomed to augments that we probably didn't even know what to do if they were removed. One implication of Stillwater Hold is that we have a lot less economies, items, and effects that we are so used to that we would actually need to relearn the meta for that specific game only. Keep in mind, if the entirety of TFT did not have augments at all, and games only existed on that portal, everything would be back to normal. You could go ahead and just memorize every stat in the game, and every team comp that's doing well. But in Set 9, there are going to be around 30 portals, and they may add more, meaning that playing a vanilla game is already difficult enough, but if even 10 of those 30 portals are drastically different, such as a situation like Stillwater Hold, it's essentially playing a different game every time, and you can't just simply follow a guide. This is why I strongly recommend following principles now instead of rules. If you compare now to the past, before, you could play 100 games and get 100 games of experience experimenting with different augments, comps, and playstyles. However, with 30 portals, you might only get around 3 games on each portal instead of 100. This is why I recommend following principles instead of rules. Now, I know what you're about to ask. What about stat checking? Can't we just check stats if we don't know what to do? Many players do this when they don't actually know how to play, myself included. With so many portals, your stat checks will now have such a low sample size that the data will not be accurate. They also remove augments and are not going to include legend data in their API, meaning that you can no longer stat check augments. What is the best in slot items for Aphelios? Perhaps it's known to be 3 specific items. But what is his best in slot on Yumi's Zoom Zone where overtime comes faster? Does that change anything? Is it still the same 3 items? As a simpler example, how do you know when an acceptable but not best in slot item is good to build on Aphelios? This changes when you are on the portal called Hearthhome where you get a Radiant item upgrade, or Scuttlepuddle where you get tons of items which allows you to easily build best in slot items, versus the Glass Industry portal where item slamming is encouraged, meaning you might not need or get best in slot items to win with Aphelios. Then you have to ask, how does that change with Lux, Kai'Sa, Urgot, and Yasuo? What if you get an early Aatrox in one of those games? Well, again, this normally isn't a big issue in previous sets, but now we have augments and 30 portals to deal with and figure out how to play with. Again, stat checking doesn't fully work because the sample sizes would be too small for exact data, and disregarding portals and removing them from the stats gives you a higher sample size, but it becomes a lot more inaccurate. So now that we have gone over how memorizing doesn't work and stat checking doesn't work, at least as well as it used to, what will work? Well, learning the actual mechanics of TFT and using your brain will work out a lot better now. Theory crafting, while still important, will become broader rather than more specific. Wide knowledge is preferred over specific knowledge. Just playing the game and figuring things out yourself is another option. Some people call this playing by feel, and that is used by many top players. In fact, a lot of the top players who compete don't actually use stats because the stats we have don't have a high enough sample size to be applied to the top level. So a lot of these players really just go by feel from their own games and watching others. Next, I suggest that you forget every TFT related advice that is outside of the specific circumstances of your game and start thinking actively. This means that after you learn all the basics, such as when to level, what comps are good, and what units are in those comps, what you need to do next is look at your actual game and decide what is best in your specific circumstance. Essentially, what I'm saying is apply your knowledge rather than just copy it. It sounds so simple on paper, and it's what we should have been doing for the past 8 sets, but a lot of players just don't play this way.
Here's what they actually do every new patch. They log in to Twitch, not the game. They watch the streamer, they go to tactics.tools, and they go, yep, that comp is a problem. And you know what I'm going to do for the rest of the 2 weeks is I'm going to complain about that comp. They don't play the game. They don't try to learn. They don't look around and try to they just go, nope, I just going to complain.
A lot of players pull up a guide from an internet browser or a stat website, then just go for the units and items listed there. There's nothing wrong with this, but this method won't get you as far as it did before. Instead, you will need to make more in-game judgments and decisions in order to climb. For the people who never did this before, what does that mean? Well, luckily for you, I'm going to tell you the basics of every TFT comp. So the 2 things you need to care about is damage and tankiness. It's that simple. Now, what are the intricacies of these? For damage, it could be split up into, I believe, around 7 categories. You have AD and AP, attack speed or mana, critical strike chance, resistance shred, anti-heal, damage amplification, and then the ableness to do damage, such as having an attack range or Quicksilver or Edge of Night. Next, I think there are around 5 things that deal with tankiness, and that is going to be health, resistances, healing, anti-damage, such as crowd control or backline access, and debuffs. I think I'm going to call these conditions that you need in each of your team comps. And you will notice that every meta team comp in the past and present fulfills almost all, if not all, of these conditions. Note that some of these conditions are more of a yes or no question, and others are scalable and can go as high as you want. For example, you can have a ton of AD or AP, you can have a medium amount, or you can have a small amount. But for something like anti-heal, you either have it or you don't. Next, you may be wondering, how are we getting all of these? And it is very simple. We get these from either traits, champion abilities or stats, augments, portals, and items. Next, let's look at how portals and legends affect all of this. Portals can give you a lot of items so you can more easily fill out your conditions, such as being able to build a Sunfire Cape or Morellonomicon for anti-heal. Having more items means you could also build a Static Shiv more easily for resistance shredding. Having portals that give more gold or prismatic augments can make it easier to access higher tier champions to get more AD or AP or stats in general to boost up some of the other conditions. The next thing to note is that some team compositions are able to access all of these conditions very easily, but don't go very deep into them. Maybe they're able to access everything, but are very low in the AD or AP or HP and resistances metrics. These comps would likely be better on the Stillwater Hold portal, because other teams may have more difficulty filling out all the other conditions. Comps that have a difficult time accessing all these conditions, but have very high stats, would likely work well in a full prismatic lobby on the other hand. Now, what about in-game decision making? If we are going for an AP comp and have a rod, should we build a Rabadon's Death Cap or Archangel Staff off the carousel? Both of these give more AP, which is one of the things that we like to see. Well, to answer that question, some comps like to delete people really quickly, so items like Death Cap would be a little bit better than Archangel Staff in a short fight, because Archangel Staff gives more ability power in the long game, and Death Cap gives the bonuses immediately. Other comps like to scale and do the opposite. Generally, if you have a lot of tankiness, you want to scale during the fight, and if you do not have tankiness, you want to end fights quickly. Let's look at another example. Let's pretend Akshan's best items are Last Whisper, Infinity Edge, and Hextech Gunblade, and we are using Shurima and Deadeye as his traits. Let's take a look and see how many of the conditions that we fill. We have some AD from the items, we have some attack speed from the Shurima trait, we have the critical strike chance from the Infinity Edge, resistance shredding with Last Whisper, we do not have anti-heal, We have damage amplification from Shurima and Deadeye, and then we also have the ableness to do damage because Akshan is a ranged unit. In terms of tankiness, he's not that tanky in terms of health and resistances, but we do have healing through Shurima and Gunblade. Lastly, we do have some anti-damage because there is some backline access with Deadeye, and sometimes you can target the backline units, and then we don't have any debuffs. But from this unit alone with 3 items and 2 traits, we almost have everything, which means that we really just need some sort of utility tank to round out the team. However, let's take a look at this situation a bit further. What happens if we get into a game and we see the augment Harmesis, which gives healing? Would we still need the Hex-type Gunblade since we now would get healing from both Harmesis, Shurima, and Gunblade? Probably not, because having 3 sources of healing might be a little bit overkill. Maybe in those situations, instead of building the Hex-type Gunblade, and remember before we said that Last Whisper, Infinity Edge, and Hex-type Gunblade in this example are the generally accepted best items on Akshan, we would actually switch out the Hex-type Gunblade for something else. Maybe we go bigger into attack damage with a Death Blade, or maybe we get more attack speed with a Rage Blade. Those are some of the ways that you could kind of tailor your team to the specific game that you are in. Lastly, I want to mention that comps are good and bad based on how easily they can meet all the conditions we listed before and how deep they can go. The differences are actually closer than they seem. This is because there are very specific circumstances that can make a comp work. Some games you just get a lot of Jins, for example, and let's say that Jin right now is really bad. I'm just making that up, but let's pretend the Jin reroll comp sucks. Even if that is true, you can still win games or top 4 with reroll Jin if the comp is given to you for free. For example, if you start the game off and you just magically get a Jin 3-star for no reason on stage 2-6, then even if you never played that comp before or never practiced it because it's listed as C tier or F tier on a tier list, you could still make the comp work by filling in all the conditions that we talked about before with the rest of your units. Essentially what I'm trying to say is, just because a comp is listed as bad doesn't mean it's going to be bad in your specific game that you're playing right now. Next, let's move on into actionable steps. So what would I do today to learn TFT? First, I would learn all the basics. Watch a leveling guide like we talked about before, and then look at a tier list so that you know where units go and when. But after that, I would say just play. Simple as that. Practice using your brain every single game and every single round. Don't look at stats and instead pick the augments that help you reach the conditions that I listed above. Next, look at your draws in that game. Make the most of the units that appear in your shop. Just because you get a champion that doesn't show up normally in a certain team comp doesn't mean you can't use it. It could just be a temporary replacement or a permanent one too. Also realize that this is a game of luck, and the only thing we could do to help us win more is to increase our odds. That's what the top players do. They know when to roll and how much to roll, and it makes their gold use much more efficient than yours. A lot of players comment on my videos saying, I'm never at this much gold or health at stage 4-1, or they just say I got lucky. The reason why it might seem that way is because most players just do not use their gold effectively. For example, I've watched some other players play and they may have 5 pairs on their bench and then they don't actually roll because a leveling guide told them not to at that current stage. Then I see other players that have 0 pairs and roll 40 gold to get 1 upgrade because again a guide told them to roll at that stage. There are too many misplays to count and kind of point out, and I know this process is going to be difficult, but just playing and learning and applying everything that you've learned is the best way now. Even in the most recent sets, stat checking has become more difficult because of the lower sample sizes, because the games are just more different, because that's how game companies just want to design their games nowadays. They just want to make things different all the time. Your brain is only as good as you make it, and the more we use it, the more used to processes it becomes. If we practice from day one how to actually play TFT instead of learning how to stat check, over the long run we will improve more than just checking websites or mindlessly following instructions. I hope this video helped you today in some of your approaches to set 9, but let me know down in the comments how you would relearn TFT if you could start over. Obviously stats and tier lists are still going to be used by a lot of players in this set, but it definitely is going to be a lot less effective. But let me know your thoughts surrounding that as well. Do you think that's better for the game or worse for the game? I personally think it's a lot better because I feel like a lot of players don't actually play the game and they just kind of follow a flowchart that someone else told them to do. That's going to be it for me today though. Hopefully you all enjoyed this video and I hope to see you all next time.